In the Hanging Out textbook, there's hardly any mention of religion or any of these spiritual aspects. There is one note at one point when they are talking about making friends, and they say teens may select their friends, but their choice is configured by the social, cultural, and economic conditions around them. Studies have shown that most friendships American youth develop are between youth of approximately the same age, in part because of age-stratified school systems and other cultural forces that segregate youth by age. Likewise, these friendship groups tend to be relatively homogeneous, resulting in what sociologists call homophily. Homophily describes the likelihood that people connect to others who share their interests and identity. Most of the teens we interviewed tended toward building friendships with others of similar age who share their interests and values. While teens' friendships were not completely segregated by race, ethnicity, religion, and gender, none of these factors was absent either. So it seems like, first of all, aspects of religion, race, and gender are not typically considered part of culture or interest and values, which is kind of interesting. And secondly, that even though it is not an explicit primary statement, it is kind of an existing part of the world, I guess, as a whole. And the world is kind of our important part of what we are seeing here, especially in the role that religion plays for our understanding of society, because people will tend to see the world in very different ways. This is the concept of worldview, as we have mentioned it previously in this class. But the worldview itself is kind of a new technology when you think about it. For example, just having this aspect of a world that we can see from the outside, and of course, the world being a round thing is itself a very new configuration of our science of what we know. And if it is something that has to do with science, it is typically something that doesn't have anything to do with religion. Those two worlds are often put in competition with one another, even though they really are not. But the idea of the world as a thing that is more or less taken into consideration by our vision of the world, and the world being connected to our spiritual world in terms that we saw in Monday's video, the largely connected idea of having a technological deity that uses whatever it is, technologically speaking, to connect with the natural world seems to be kind of antithetical. These two paintings here are obviously representations of a Jesus figure, but that Jesus figure is holding a globe that's apparently made out of glass of some sort. And that glass crystal orb of whatever it is a representation of the world as it was understood in the Middle Ages. Both of those paintings are dated from the 16th century. And talking about what the world means to God, and in this case, Jesus as the representation of God holding this orb means that he has that capacity to take over the entirety of the world, and perhaps the skies above, the heavens that are typically understood as the domain of God. Nevertheless, in the context of what the Bible is telling us about quote unquote the world itself is not actually present because it is a technology. Now, the Old Testament does have elements of mentioning the environment around the people who were uh, living during the Old Testament era. The New Testament has a few newer reflections on the world itself, mostly having to do with the universe, kind of the creation, kind of, what God made out of the world. And that is probably the most important ways in which the Bible and the New Testament especially is developing this technology of the world, is that it is developing this idea of the things that are around us are something that we are owed to, or that is a result of God's inspiration or God's power on the world. And so, as a result of that, seeing those things around us is a way for us to see the greatness of the deity. It is a technology, but it is a technology that is once again used by God, the figure God, to show us that the things that he does are great, the things that he does are real, and of course, everything in that context becomes a representation of God's work. And that in and of itself is, of course, not unique to Christianity. And in fact, in very many places of the world, there are these representations of the world, the world in different shapes or forms. This particular representation here is typically known as a cosmogram. A cosmogram is a representation of the world. This is the cover of a Aztec codex. So codex is essentially a book from the Middle Ages once again, and this particular codex is not dated because it was not found until essentially the 18th century. So this is apparently dated to the pre-Hispanic era, survived the Hispanic conquest, and the influence of Spanish cultural colonization of Mexico, and eventually it's found by a Hungarian collector and then makes its way to an English store and now appears in a British museum. This codex is apparently a collection of pre-Hispanic rituals of some sort, and the cover here is showing us essentially the representation of the world with, at the middle of it, a deity with their tools that are actual tools, hand tools that you would think of it today, but also around it, the trees that the god has made and the result of God's influence on earth. In this case, this particular deity being represented in the middle of the world itself, and the world being represented as a square, is also giving us a different view of how this pre-Hispanic people were thinking about the world around them and how they think that this particular central character was able to affect the world around them. In this case, having tools, again, actual tools that they can use, that the deity can use to create the world, maybe to build the world itself, to fashion the world in their image or in somebody else's image, means having the possibility to connect the world of the deity, which is supernatural, to the world of our daily life, which is, well, natural of some sort. So the connection between the supernatural and the digital ways to communicate is not particularly surprising because it is still, any way we look at it, a representation of how we think of the world as it is. The Aztec way to see the world as an industrious, very highly hierarchical people in the second millennium represents the architectural work of people that is able to build things with tools compared to the people of the Levant who were writing the New Testament and the people before them who were writing the Old Testament, which were more nomadic, maybe a little bit of an early agricultural culture, but for who the tools would be a lot more elementary and perhaps a lot more of an accessory than for the Aztec, who had a kind of a monumental architecture compared to ancient Hebrews and the early Christians. And so in our world today, the tools are technological, the tools are quote unquote digital. And it is a question that has to be addressed by most religious systems that have to deal with the new way of the world compared with the old way of the world that it is more or less portrayed in the scriptures. This article here from Haaretz, a Israeli newspaper, talking about the ultra-Orthodox Jews must choose between obedience to their rabbis or to their smartphone, because the ultra-Orthodox Jews, who are typically understood as sticking out of the modern traditions or the modern world, are also embracing the smartphone, which would be pretty much necessary for most daily activities for contact and whatnot. And in this case, this is a dilemma that many people have to face of, well, maybe being able to get in touch with their family, or maybe being able to get a job, and on the other hand, using this technology that is apparently forbidden. Now, that being said, this is something that is a little bit bigger than what the larger community as a whole might want to distinguish, because the idea that technology allows us to connect with something else in the world still has a value for a lot of people in religious communities, and especially if the means to accessing the world means accessing a world that is not currently available for many people, like this particular part of the world here, the Kotel or Western Wall, that is separating the city of Jerusalem, in which is a holy place for Jewish people. It is not necessarily a place that most Jews are able to access for political reasons, financial reasons, and whatever. However, this is a way that especially the Israeli government has been using to connect to the Jewish diaspora for people all over the world who identify with this place. And it is very much possible for them to use Twitter, for example, to access those parts of their community, to access that part of their spirituality using technology. The first few messages that were posted to the Western Wall's Twitter account were these: "Good night, my friends, sending you hugs from the Holy Land," saying good morning, or Jerusalem Day events in Jerusalem kind of ends up um, as a commercial account of some sort. Eventually, there's a lot more of a overt kind of maybe propaganda talking about the bombings that are happening and the role of Hamas in Israel, and kind of a very different thing, I guess. But all this to say that this Twitter account is no longer particularly active, even though it is available, but it is possible for people, if they wish, to tweet their prayers to the Western Wall if they cannot access it directly. And in a sense, here, technology is connecting people through their representations of the world using technology that does not particularly impede on the larger effect of God and the deity outside of this world, because the wall is a representation of God and the people are representations of God themselves. So connecting these different parts in and of themselves is not a very controversial idea. Nevertheless, because we are able to connect more ideas and more people, we also have the possibility of connecting a much larger group of people than maybe could ever be expected. This is a Kaodai altar, sorry, that is from a religious system that has been popping up pretty much all over South Vietnam since the 1970s. Now, typically, the idea of Cao Dai existed before this, but because of technology, it has been able to connect a whole lot more people outside of Vietnam as well, including Vietnamese people who were exiled and evacuated or otherwise had to leave Vietnam since the Vietnam War. So the possibility of this small religious movement that connects various deities, and in this case, the Jesus and Lao Tzu and Hindu deities and whatever other characters are part of this system here, including, for example, Joan of Arc and Victor Hugo, a French historical figure. The religious system is using with technology its very increasing power to connect more things with more idea, with more people, with more parts of the world, to create this much larger system of religious belief that is connected to everything, while at the same time being central on essentially a ethnic identity. There are today Cao Dai temples in southern France and many other parts of the world. So, however many people are officially part of this this religious system, there are a few millions as far as we know. Connecting people across North America and Asia and Europe and even Australia through this Vietnamese slash Cao Dai diaspora, the images that are connecting also these various deities across the world through a more or less accessible technology of representations, visuals, and the such is very important in making people feel like they are connected to their people, to their deity. And of course, this is a very modern way to think about the deity, but it is not a unique one because there are many people who are searching for these answers across the world, for these kinds of representations of home or maybe of the supernatural of some sort. This particular building here is from the Positivist Church in Brazil, a religion that calls itself the Templo da Humanidade, which is essentially the temple of humanity, or maybe the religion of humanity, if you want to call it that, following French philosopher Auguste Comte from the early 19th century. This is a religious system that is agnostic, that is largely following human rights and human principles much more than it has to do the with the larger idea of the supernatural as we typically understand it. But the fact that there is no supernatural God, no afterlife, no idea of traditional religion as we would think about it, but much more about scientific intellectual achievement, the living and dead men and women who have some kind of significance to humanity as a whole, makes this a somewhat religious system that is gathering a lot of people from all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of identities towards a larger reverence to the things that are important to them. And of course, again, that in itself is a very relatable message that is mostly possible through the advent of technology, or in this case, being able to read a book from another place in the world and transferring this book and transferring those ideas and turning this into a religious system. And on the much larger sense, of course, today, the possibility to have very visually powerful ideas and visually powerful ideas that connect to other powerful ideas makes the connections between people much more possible than it was before. And even though this is much more a matter of being a fan or a follower of a certain idea or a certain work of art, it remains a matter in which people are connecting through these images to something that they see as bigger than themselves, as maybe more relevant to their lives than anything else they could see in the world around them. And here, the relationship to the natural is almost completely subverted to having a relationship to the cultural. And a cultural form of religion would allow people to have these broader principles of behavior, these broader ideas to connect with one another through the things that are meaningful to them in a way that up until this point was really out of the domain of the religious thought as we typically understand it. And that much is very much a matter of a change introduced by the digital communications.